Commission of the Roman Catholic Diocese of San Diego. And we have you up here. Oh, this is turned off. And I don't have his title in front of me. So Victor's going to tell us what he's going to talk about. Please welcome with me, Victor Carmona.
Good morning, everyone.
Good morning.
Buenos dias. Good morning to everyone here and everyone joining us online. So there's the title of my presentation today, Bordering on Temptation, Idolatry, Polarization, and the Reign of God at the U.S.-Mexico border. So in the next 22 minutes or so, I'm going to suggest that our society's idolatrous relationship with the U.S.-Mexico border reflects a desire to be godlike, shaping our ability to discern how to act there, informing who we are as a people. I'm going to be doing this using the pastoral spiral as my method. I'm going to begin with experience, move on to analysis, reflection, and then action, focusing on fear, polarization, temptation, and idolatry, and ending with compassion as risk-taking. The sources that I'm going to be in conversation with are, in each of these sections, are on the screen right now. So I want to thank again Bill for the invitation and for the opportunity to explore this question with you. So is idolatry dead at the U.S.-Mexico border? My answer will be no. Will that be definitely no. So let's begin. Experience fear. The ongoing polarization roiling the United States, including among Catholics, continues being experienced at the U.S.-Mexico border in brutal, dehumanizing ways. Two recent cases, one in Texas and one in California, illustrate how so. Early last February, Texas Attorney General Ken Paxton launched an investigation into Catholic nonprofits providing humanitarian assistance to immigrants and asylum seekers at the state. He gave them less than a day to provide sensitive records on those who they served, at risk of having their registration to operate in the state revoked. One of the organizations, Annunciation House, which has been operating guest houses and other support services in El Paso since 1976, resisted. According to the Texas Tribune, Paxton's office sent Annunciation House an administrative subpoena demanding documents since January 2022, including, quote, referrals made on behalf of the group as legal services, identifying information about people who have received services from Annunciation House, and all applications with the Emergency Food and Shelter Program, close quote. Annunciation House sought an extension from the state to review the subpoena and to determine which information they were legally required to produce. When the state denied it, Annunciation House sued. Paxton counter-sued, alleging the nonprofit operates stash houses and supports human smuggling. This matter is still pending in the courts. Late last February, a demolition crew demolished a makeshift migrant camp near Jacumba, California, on behalf of the federal government. Volunteers, many of them with the American Friends Service Committee, the Quakers, had helped build the camp so asylum seekers could withstand the cold, wet winter temperatures, which can drop to 30 degrees there. The camp is situated next to Interstate 8 in the remote mountainous border town between San Diego, Tijuana to the west, and Calexico, Mexicali to the east. A growing number of asylum seekers from all over the world, including families with children, have been crossing through the border fence nearby to wait for the Border Patrol to surrender themselves. At times, 200 people will be waiting for more than a day. After the demolition crew completed its work, volunteers rebuilt the camp. 2 days later, a group of young men vandalized it, destroying tarps and pallets making up the structures. In the midst of this, a court hearing last month, the Biden administration denied the Border Patrol had to provide food and shelter for immigrant children in the camp. Its argument is that they are free to leave, according to a report by AP News, quote, as long as they don't proceed further into the United States, close quote. This matter is also still pending in the courts. It is unclear if the vandals are facing any legal action. Fear is palpable in both cases, not just the fear of immigrants and asylum seekers who are escaping the cumulative and immediate effects of violence, whether in the form of unrelenting poverty or persecution. In the context of our conversation on idolatry, what needs to draw our attention is the fear betrayed by the actions of the Texas Attorney General at Annunciation House and the young vandals at the Jacumba migrant camp. They reflect polarizing fears that broader U.S. society has toward the U.S.-Mexico border. It is a deep-seated polarizing fear that limits our ability to discern reality and act prudently and compassionately there. So, analysis. Polarization. Our polarizing fear towards immigrants and asylum seekers at the U.S.-Mexico border serves a broader purpose. The actions of the Texas Attorney General are part of a strategy by right-wing Republican government officials, including in Congress, that since 2022 have been pressuring Catholic charities and nonprofits from other faith communities that provide assistance to immigrants and asylum seekers at the border. The actions of the federal government in California illustrate how Democratic government officials have been unable to offer a sustained, coherent response to the suffering of immigrants and asylum seekers at the border. Though institutional and structural, both sets of actions reflect human agency. Moises Naim's The Revenge of Power offers some insights into how so. Naim argues that autocrats across the world from both the left, including Mexico's Andrés Manuel López Obrador, and the right, including the United States' Donald Trump, are leveraging populism, polarization, and post-truth to attain power democratically and then retain it. He calls this the 3P strategy. Populism pits the noble and pure public against a corrupt elite. As part of that strategy, autocrats use narratives to frame most immigrants as dangerous and national borders as out of control, thus threatening the good people. Polarization drives a wedge between those who are on the side of the people and those who are not. Quote, it eliminates the possibility of a middle ground pushing every single person and organization to take sides, close quote. Post-truth then further sharpens and reinforces the effects of populism and polarization by eviscerating shared objective standards that determine what is true and what is not. A particularly challenging aspect of polarization is that the autocrat counts on divisive rhetoric having an equally sharp and forceful rebuke. The autocrat's illiberal narrative, i.e., immigrants, quote, are poisoning the blood of our country, close quote. And its rebuke increases the divide between supporters and opponents and deteriorates any middle ground. Opposing autocrats and their 3P strategy is not easy. Furthermore, because while their narratives offer attractive, if simplistic solutions to a host of questions, including immigration and border enforcement, those of their opponents are less inspiring and often abstract, like calling for separation of powers and calling for checks and balances. Naim thus concludes that while opponents to autocrats may not entirely overcome the power of their narratives, quote, we can blunt the impact by stressing that freedom and democracy lead to human flourishing in a way autocracy never can, close quote. Assuming that Naim's analysis is correct, his insights beg the question of how and why Catholic faith communities, including our leaders, should respond to polarization and polarizing fear in cases like those in Texas and California. Some have chosen to remain silent for multiple reasons, including prudential ones. Others have offered opposition by providing alternative narratives, including those grounded on the practice of compassion and neighborly love. Temptation and idolatry, a reflection. While Naim's concluding turn to human flourishing is apt for the public square, from a theological ethical perspective, it points to, yet is unable to address, a deeper still reality that calls us to grapple with the influence of temptation and idolatry in U.S. society's relationship with the southern border. That is the case among Catholics and fellow Christians who knowingly or not use our faith to further fear and polarization in the manner suggested by Naim. In other words, there is more to this polarizing fear than meets the eye. To that end, in this section, I place Kavanaugh's The Uses of Idolatry in dialogue with Scripture, scholars, also Roberto Goizueta's Christ Our Companion, and Orlando Espín's Idol and Grace. Here, I'd like to share 3 initial insights that stem from that dialogue. So first claim, U.S. society has an idolatrous relationship with the U.S.-Mexico border. It is a relationship that reflects the temptations of security, pride, and power to be like God. I am not convinced that we have a similar relationship with the U.S.-Canadian border. In prayer and work, I've been increasingly turning to Jesus' experiences with temptation at the desert, because the desert marks the lives of many border communities and the immigrants and asylum seekers who reach them. In the Gospel of Matthew, as Jesus' 40-day fast comes to an end, he faces 3 temptations from the devil. One from hunger, quote, "If you are the Son of God, command these stones to become loaves of bread," close quote. Another born of pride, quote, "If you are the Son of God, throw yourself down from the pinnacle of the temple, and God will command his angels to save you," close quote. And a third temptation born of the desire for power, quote, "Showing him all the kingdoms of the world and their glory, the devil said to Jesus, 'All these I give to you if you fall down and worship me.'" Jesus also struggled with this question of right worship. The work of biblical scholar Mark Powell and Jose Antonio Pagola have focused my attention beyond the devil's actions to a deeper claim to meaning and truth, that in the desert, Jesus learned to trust that God, who he calls his Father, will provide so that he may proclaim the reign of God in word and deed. That trust, in turn, allows Jesus to see more fully, to see reality more fully, permitting him to act accordingly, compassionately and freely. This is very much an exploration still. My intuition is that there is an analogy between how we as individuals face the temptations that stem from a fearful desire for security, including from hunger, for pride, and for power, and the way that we as a society, including those among us who self-identify as Jesus' disciple, act at the border. It seems that our actions there reflect the pursuit of an impossible certainty, a social sin that limits our ability to discern reality at the border. Kavanaugh's capacious and intriguing treatment of idolatry points out a subtle distinction that further feeds that intuition. Scripture differentiates between recognizing ourselves as being made in the image and likeness of God and a desire to be like God. Quote, "In the former, human beings are a manifestation of God's goodness in creative power, having their continued being completely dependent on God's grace. In the latter, likeness of God is not received, but is grasped at." And there is that word again, grasp. "With the intent not to manifest God, but to replace God. Both aspire to bridge the gap between humanity and divinity," close quote. That insight stems from Scripture's delicate interplay between transcendence and immanence, he writes. when discerning the nature of humanity's relationship with God. Such a dance at a knife's edge is called for, and indeed necessary, if we are to be true to the otherness of our Creator and to the materiality of our creatureliness. Second claim, our society's idolatrous relationship with the US-Mexico border can shape interpretations, including willfully ignorant ones, of Catholic social teaching on migration. Kavanaugh's attention to how challenging a task worshiping is, that is, of worshiping in a way that is true to God's otherness and to our materiality, informs his treatment of idolatry in a sympathetic key. It is necessary, he insists, to overcome a series of ideological ideologicals and practical narrative binaries that the West has created for multiple reasons, including self-flattery to distinguish us from them. The construction of such binaries has been questioned and challenged for decades by Latinx theologians, as well as border scholars and communities. For that reason, I need to be mindful of Orlando Espín's work, which suggests that popular Catholicism, as lived by US Latinx communities and communities across Latin America, has been integrating that narrative of binaries, has been interrupting that narrative of binaries from the ground. That praxis stems from the ways in which our communities have woven together medieval, pre-Tridentine Iberian Catholicism, African religious practices. Remember that 2/3 of slaves were taken to present-day South America, and indigenous faith. Where the full agreement lies, I believe, is with Kavanaugh's observation of the West's, though perhaps more narrowingly, the English-speaking West's self-flattery to distinguish us from them. Roberto Goizueta's Christ Our Companion Towards a Theological Aesthetic of Liberation includes a beautifully challenging section calling us to reimagine the US-Mexico border. To that end, he offers a historically informed perspective that reminds our conversation today of just how deeply seated and violently harmful that self-flattery is. Goizueta focuses our attention on the different ways in which Protestant Christianity in the continent's north and Catholic Christianity in its south conceived of the meaning and implications of encountering indigenous peoples first, including through violence in its many forms and degrees, and eventually each other at the present-day US-Mexico border. It is a difference that can be tended to in the subtle distinction between border and frontera. Quote, in the north, the border is perceived as moving in only one direction, outwards. In the south, the border is perceived as allowing for movement in both directions. In the north, any movement back across the border is thus perceived as an incursion from the forces of evil and backwardness into the realm of light and progress. In the south, such movements affirms differences while being mutually enriching, close quote. There is a difference between a conception of the border, which to this day is charged with a civilizing zeal that furthers a powerful binary narrative. English speaker, Christian, and civilized, versus Spanish speaker, Catholic, and thus not actually Christian for some US Christians, and heathen, us against them. Ustedes contra nosotros. It is a distinction that is being sharpened. The ongoing failure by many English-speaking Christians to question the above binary narrative that is still in effect in their relationship with the US-Mexico border has powerful consequences. It is a failure that US Catholics with a post-Tridentine understanding of Catholicism, one which I think has not yet received Vatican II, may also share. It is a failure that informs and forms the fear that lurks behind the actions of the Texas Attorney General in El Paso and the vandals in Jacumba. It is a failure that informs the moral imagination of some of my fellow Catholics who may misinterpret, including in a willfully ignorant way, Catholic social teaching on migration on the border. In Strangers No Longer, sovereign, quote, sovereign nations have the right to control their borders, close quote. The teaching's acknowledgement does not stem from a fear of the other, from a fear that leads to an idolatrous affirmation of the self, grasping for security, pride, and power to be like God. You can see why Kavanaugh's invitation to treat idolatry in a sympathetic key is challenging. In the coming months, we will likely see fellow Catholics and other Christians in the U.S. relate to the border in an idolatrous and fearful way. It is a fear that limits our faith community's capacity to discern reality at the border and act compassionately and prudently there. That fear takes me briefly to the third and final claim. Behavior matters. Our society's idolatrous relationship with the US-Mexico border is likely having a mirroring effect on us, regardless of religious affiliation, accordingly forming or deforming us as a people. Kavanaugh's insight on the effects of idolatrous actions on the effects that idolatrous actions has on the people who engages in it has powerful implications for us. The mirroring effect stems from the observation in Scripture that the worship of idols turns the Israelite people into a similarly lifeless object, deeply impacting the people. Quote, when they turn to idols, an exchange takes place in which they forfeit the glory of God and instead become as false, worthless, detestable, shameful, and bovine as the idols they worship, close quote. Paul's letters call Christians to be mindful to this dynamic. Of concern from an ethical standpoint is that such idolatry has the people sanction unjust human relations. Orlando Espín's Idol and Grace would further call us to be vigilant to the ways in which such power asymmetries shape the traditioning of our faith, including our faith community's praxis. Kavanaugh's insights, along with Espín's, have me conclude that our society's fearfully polarizing relationship with the border is likely having a deforming effect on us as a people. Action. Compassion is risk-taking. So to conclude, to find a way forward, faith communities need to support practices that take up the risk of being compassionate, both with each other. Polarization aims at eviscerating the possibility of middle ground in the US, and with others at the border. Kavanaugh's work, Espín's and Goizueta's ultimately as well, echo the need to risk such compassion if we are to awaken from our stupor. And as to why, I leave the final word to Kavanaugh. Quote, the best remedy for idolatry is an uncontrollable encounter with the incarnate God in the chaos and vulnerability of those who are marginalized by the idolatrous systems that eat people alive. Gracias.
Muchas gracias, Victor. Next, we will hear from Stan Chiuilo, Don't Bow Down and Worship Idols. I am the Lord your God, a biblical theological critique of idolatry. But first, who is Stan Chiuilo? Stan Chiuilo is a priest of Nigeria's Ogun Diocese. He'll do that right for you. He's a research professor here at the Center for World Catholicism at DePaul, where he is also an associate professor of Catholic Studies. He is also an honorary professor at Durham University in the UK and a visiting research scholar at the University of Nigeria. He is also the coordinating servant, we need to adopt that title here, of the Pan-African Catholic Theology and Pastoral Network, PACTPAN, as well as the North American coordinator of the, quote, Doing Theology from the Existential Peripheries, which is a project of the Vatican's Dicastery for Integral Human Development. He edits and directs Concilium, the International Journal of Theology, and serves on the boards of numerous other academic journals. In his spare time, he sits on the senior advisory board of Templeton's Religious Trust Project on global spiritual formation for religious leaders and represents Africa in an international project supported by the Dicastery for Integral Human Development and several Catholic charities on developing the ethics of philanthropy and stewardship. He has many books, including the recent Handbook of African Catholicism and Ecological Ethics for Cosmic Flourishing, which I'm sure are available outside. So, Father Elo.
Thank you very much for that generous introduction. And thank you, everyone. It's such an honor to speak to this distinguished audience. I'm going to talk on Don't Bow Down and Worship Idols. In this discourse, I wish to read the episode of the golden calf in Exodus 32, to test two of Kavanaugh's claim in his new book, The Uses of Idolatry. One, by exploring what the ubiquity of worship means for understanding our human condition and the human hunger for meaning, relationships, and connections with someone or something beyond the self. Secondly, that idolatry is not so much a metaphysical error as it is misplaced loyalty. Idolatry is about behavior, not simply belief, unquote. I like to begin with highlighting the importance of community or belongingness, because we all are connected or should be connected in a bond of relationship through our participation in the bond of life and the bond of love. What makes for human and cosmic flourishing are the choices we make and our behaviors or conduct in realizing that bond of love or in harming it through our worship either of the true God or of false gods. The book of Genesis begins with the story of the creation of all things from chaos and nothingness and the shaping of a human community where all lives and all that exists flourished in a harmonious manner. All forms of worship, I claim, are communal in nature. Worship is constitutive of community. Worship brings people together, particularly because the object or symbol of worship embodies a common meaning to which the adherents of communities of faith submit. Adherents who are so constituted through a social or spiritual identification, embodied and mediated through beliefs, symbols, and the artifacts, might worship a particular god or deity that is considered distinctive from other communities of faith. However, the way people worship is a pointer to their behavior, loyalty, outlook, and ethics. The Old Testament shows that any true worship is one that creates, heals, and restores the community and the entire creation by the affirmation and profession of the secularity of God's power in keeping the world in being in what the ancients called exitus reditus. We come from God and we return to God. It is this theoandrocentric secularity that is disrupted, distorted, and destroyed by the worship of any false god, any idol. It is very important to highlight this third element of belonging and community in the biblical idolatry critique for many reasons. First, worship in the Old Testament presupposes a community with a distinctive sense of identity. Second, this sense of identity is often defined by foundational narratives that define the people and confer on them that claim distinctive identity from other peoples or nations or worshiping communities. In the Old Testament, we find 5 foundational narratives, among others, which stand out with regard to the land, the covenant, the Sabbath, the temple, the Lord, and the promise mediated in both the people and the messengers and prophets of God. Third is the question of who God is and who is this human person with whom God establishes a relationship vis-a-vis the blessings and curses that come with this relationship with God. So even though my focus is on the Old Testament, let me add here that the paradigmatic nature of the mysteries of the Incarnation and the Paschal mystery, along with the words and deeds of Jesus in the constitution of the community of faith that offers itself to the world as a sign of contradiction and an exemplar manifestation of what happens when a self-sacrificing love that transcends the self can potentiate the members of any given community to aspire towards the ultimate good that is beyond us all. The foundational narratives, the worship of God, the promises of blessings and the threats of punishment, and the relationship between the people of Israel and God in the Old Testament helps to understand the why of the biblical distinction between the worship of the true God and the worship of false God. The foundational account of the covenant beginning in Exodus 19 and reaching its high point in the giving of the 10 Commandments and the second commandment of the Decalogue, don't bow down and worship idols. I am the Lord your God, in Exodus 25, brings us to the heart of the matter, why God forbade the people from worshiping any idols. The answer is simple. There is only one God, who is shown in many passages to be a jealous God, who brooks no opposition or any image and likeness. This is why the prohibition in Exodus is fairly comprehensive and detailed. God prohibits the manufacture of any images of anything in the heavens above or the earth below or the waters beneath the earth and every visible object which can be represented. Now, made in the image and likeness of God, which is what Genesis says, that the human person is made in the image and likeness of God. It seems that God has violated his own rule in creating the human person in God's image and likeness. If God created the human person in God's image and likeness, then God committed the first act of idolatry in the Old Testament. Thus, we might suppose that the propensity of humans to make images after themselves is simply a continuation of God's own divine positive act of creating humans in God's image and likeness. We are simply doing what God did. However, Psalm 8 verse 6 seems to be aware of this possibility of confusion, of equating God's positive act of making humans in God's image and likeness by emphasizing that God has made humans little less than a God. Humans are meant then to give God glory in all they do and not act as God or as if they are above God. And I make this very important point in terms of how I'm understand the text and in my own personal faith. And that is, being human is enough. And embracing this gift of fullness in being human, nothing more, nothing less, seems to me to be the beating heart of monotheism in the Old Testament. It is also the path to human happiness and fulfillment, individually and collectively. The Old Testament's understanding of idolatry rests squarely on this central truth. Being human is enough. Psalm 109 makes this point very clearly in the confession of sin of the faithful to God in these words. In verse 9, the sinner says, "At Horeb they fashioned a calf, worshipped a metal statue. They exchanged their glory for the image of a grass-eating bull." Not only that humans degraded their glory that is conferred on them by God this way, they also failed to remember the great deeds of God in their midst. Idolatry is presented here as a forgetfulness of what is true, beautiful, life-giving, and a failure to give thanks to God who is good and whose mercy endures forever. Anything more or less than what is truly human is a distortion of the truth, a distortion of creation, a distortion of God, and a violation and disloyalty to our true self and to God, who the Old Testament presents as the source of life and who does mighty deeds. What is needed, therefore, is a proper scale of value, a balance, a humble embrace of the gift of our humanity and creatureliness in order to overcome idolatry. This invitation to recognize the true self before God and the boundless beauty of creation reflecting the glory of God is what John Calvin was thinking about in the first line of his very important work, The Institute of the Christian Faith, when he writes that there are two questions that we all face, everyone must answer. Who is God? Who is the human person? He concluded that if we present the wrong answer to the first question, we will most certainly get the second question wrong as well. Idolatry gets the first question, who is God, wrong, and that is why it also gets the second question, who the human person is, wrong. Calvin argues that it seems that humans believe that their knowledge of themselves and their knowledge of God are equal or tied until they remove that gaze on from themselves, modeling themselves after the examples of saints and great biblical figures like Moses and Elijah, who lifted their gaze toward God, not on themselves, and thus realized the prodigious feats that they did in the name of God and brought glory to God. It is in pondering the absolute perfection of God that the human pride and foolishness that leads to idolatry could be healed, according to Calvin. Why? Because so long as we do not look beyond ourselves and beyond the earth, we are quite pleased with our own righteousness, our wisdom and virtue. We address ourselves in most flattering terms and seem to ourselves like demigods. But our knowledge of ourselves, unmoored from God's perfection and righteousness, keeps humans imprisoned in utter helplessness. But what can unveil human hypocrisy, according to Calvin, is our gazing on that perfection, that righteousness and wisdom and virtue to which, as a standard, we are bound to be conformed. This is a healing of our humanity and triggers the needed conversion, where what formerly delighted humans by its false show of righteousness will become polluted with greatest iniquity. What strangely imposed upon humans and titillated their pride and inflated their ego under the name of wisdom will disgust by its extreme folly. And what presented the appearance of virtuous energy and domination will be laid bare as the most miserable impotence and pitiless vulnerability. Indeed, the only true image of God in the Christian account is Jesus Christ, who bears the very image of God's substance, according to Hebrews chapter 1, verse 3. This phrase, bearing the very image of God, expresses the fact that the Son is both personally distinct from and yet literally equal to him, of whose essence he is the adequate imprint, according to Lidon. He is not merely the image, character of God, He is the image or impress of God's substance or essence. The Son is not merely the artificer in the formation of the world, but the one through whom, in whom, and for whom all things are made, and in whom they subsist. Humans realize the fullness of the image of God in them by sharing the form of the image of the Son, to which they are destined. Through sharing in the image of the Son, humans are changed in the form of in form to the image of the Lord. They put on a new man, an allusion to Genesis 1:26, being made in the image and likeness of God. And this shatters the illusory desire, temptation, and project to be like God by our first parents, the distortion of the golden calf, or the failed project of Babel, among others. That is why Sacrosanctum Concilium says that Jesus is the one who truly deserves the fullness of divine worship, because through him, with him, and in him, there is a reconciliation of the various contradictions that we find and distortion in our search for God and in our search for what it means to be human. So how does this distortion manifest finally in the case of the golden calf? I see my time is just 5 minutes. I'm just clearing my throat. So now, without going into the details of the various framing of God in the different traditions of the Pentateuch, we see that the people of Israel are exposed to the same level of punishment from God like other nations. They face constant divine threats, wrath of annihilation. In the worship of the golden calf, there are actually two parts of that worship. I mean, the account we find there. Some say a combination of the priestly and the non-priestly sources. So quickly, the first account says Moses went up to the mountain and he didn't come down again. And the people said, well, we don't know what happened to this man. We need to find another person to lead us. So the question is, why were they so scared to think that Moses will not come down? Could it be that God was considered a capricious creature who kills those who go to encounter him? Obviously, you find in other passages that it says, no one sees God and lives. And so even though Moses was invited, maybe he went up and didn't come down. Maybe God killed him. Whatever happens is the people find themselves vulnerable, reflecting again the human vulnerability and human finality. And they began to look for something, crutches on which to stand. That's the first account. And Aaron says, okay, bring your earrings and all that. And then he made a calf. And then God gets angry. Moses comes down. And then Moses burns the calf and then puts makes the water out of the ashes and forces the people to drink. The account stops there. The one interesting, the second account, which concerns us here, is that then Moses asked Aaron, why did these people do to you? What did these people do to you that you should lead them into a grave sin? Aaron says here, do not let my Lord be angry. You know how the people are prone to evil. They said to me, make a God to go before us. As for this man Moses, who brought us out of the land of Egypt, we do not know what has happened to him. So I told them, whoever is wearing gold, take it off. They gave it to me. I threw it into the fire, and this calf came out. So he didn't say, I made the calf. You threw it into the fire, and suddenly the calf came out. Now, the human propensity again, not to take responsibility for the works of our own hands, but most importantly, is the blame game, because in some commentaries, people say, well, how could the people have had these gold earrings since they were slaves? So they worshipped. This happened because, as you read further, that there was, as they did this making of the calf, to the delight of their foes. who are these foes who had infiltrated the ranks of Israel. But what we see here is the ubiquitousness of worship. We also see that worship is not simply an individual thing, it is constitutive of community. We also see here that idol worship, the worship of false gods, has consequences not just for the individual, for the entire community. And we see further that monotheism, particularly the Abrahamic religion, often project this total horizon to its beliefs, behavior, and a sense of belonging that is restricted with canons, cultural traditions, rituals, laws, and moral prescriptions. But when you look at the whole story of the constant tension among God's people in Israel and Moses, my contention is that the question is not so much about religious end. The people were concerned about quotidian issues of water, of food, of security against their enemies, and their search for an infinite horizon, or for a total horizon that can guarantee them their safety and their future. In all cases, what is at stake is what kind of relationship do we have with this God, and how do we construct that relationship? It might not be possible for me in this presentation to read or reread the story of the golden calf from the perspective of an African Christian. But I want to leave you with these few thoughts. First is that my contention is that what is not of God and what is of God, true and false gods, are often complicated in theology and in politics or social ethics. However, if we read the story of the golden calf from the side of the underclass of this world, it might be that the golden calf was an act of resistance against an all-conquering God and an all-powerful male leader, Moses. It might be that the 10 spies who warned the people not to take the land of other people, that these people will fight back and are strong enough to defend their land, are the voices of reason rather than of disbelief for a reconsideration of the march to Canaan, to conquer people in the name of God. Could it be then that the God of Moses is the problem rather than the people who worship other gods? That's why I think that God talk must be placed side by side with idolatry critique, because your own God might be my own idol. Thank you.
Oh, you gotta love a talk that puts the most provocative sentences at the very end. So it's a very good thing that we're gonna have a little Q&A after the fact. But before we get to that, we get to Jeremiah, my personal favorite prophet. We will be hearing from Bungishabaku Katho. Dr. Katho, who I will be calling him going forward, has a PhD in biblical studies from the University of Natal, now the University of KwaZulu-Natal, in Piotr, my Dutch is as bad as my, thank you, South Africa. Currently, he serves as professor of Old Testament studies at Shalom University in Bunia, the Democratic Republic of the Congo, where he also directs the School of Theology's Postgraduate Studies program. And he is a senior researcher at CRMD Bunia, which is Bunia's Multidisciplinary Research Center for Development. He has written and presented extensively on the Old Testament's Book of Jeremiah, including Reading Jeremiah in Africa, Biblical Essays in Sociopolitical Imagination, and a commentary in French in the Commentaires Bibliques Contemporains series. My French is as bad as my Dutch. He also recently contributed to the Oxford Handbook of Jeremiah with a chapter entitled Jeremiah Interpretation in Subaltern Context. And outside of the Academy, he is also the founder and the executive director of the Jeremiah Center for Faith and Society, which is a nonprofit working to build a just and peaceful society through the DRC through networking, research, and publications. And Dr. Katho will be talking to us about idolatry, dysfunctional communities, and failed states in the book of Jeremiah, interpreting idolatry in Jeremiah from an African perspective. Dr. Katho.
Morning. I'm a bit comfortable today with the Bible. I texted my friend yesterday and said, I'm doing theology with philosophers and sociologists. Yeah, it is. Yeah, I learned a lot yesterday. So idolatry, dysfunctional community and failed state in the book of Jeremiah. We escaped this plan. A friend. Any reflection on idolatry in the Bible and the contemporary world must start with the relationship between God and his creation. And this is what I teach in my Old Testament theology class. The Bible opens with God's speech. This speech confronts the modern reader with the world's view of the Bible. And God said. God, who is a spirit, speaks, and a physical world comes into being. God spoke the world into being. In other words, a spirit talks and a physical world comes into being. What this means is that from the biblical point of view, the spirit world and the physical world are intimately related. From the African perspective, words spoken by an authority have power. They can either bless or curse. They can bring life or death. Thus, in traditional African, words do not simply accompany action. Words constitute action. Thus, the traditional African world is very much aware of the symbiosis between the spiritual and the physical world. And the implication is that God, the creator, who chose to create by his words, has also chosen to remain in close relationship with his creation. The ultimate goal of this relationship is to bring life into creation. The whole creation lives and is energized by the spirit of the creator. And the fullness of this life and of this energy for human being depends on our choice and the quality of the relationship with God. This is why Moses urges the people of Israel, as individuals and as a nation, to choose life. In Deuteronomy chapter 30, verse 19, choose life. The ultimate goal of this relationship, is it? No? Yeah, this is why Moses, have already said that. Moses urges people to choose life, not death. And in Deuteronomy chapter 30, verse 19, that we have just read, life is written in plural, hahayim. This is an abstract plurality, not the existence of many lives. And I will translate it, choose life at its best, or choose the fullness of life, both quantitatively and qualitatively. This is what Moses is urging the people of Israel. This is life in its fullness for individuals, for community, and nation. And this fullness of life is possible only through this qualitative union with God the Creator. Having said this, it has now amply been demonstrated that humanity as a whole is facing its ultimate crisis. Avery calls it civilization crisis, and he argues that these civilization crises are interlinked and they are all man-made. My argument in this paper is that the root of this crisis of our society is the crisis of the relationship between the Creator and His creation. What Avery called the civilization's crisis is actually a spiritual crisis of humanity. By losing the link between the creation and His Creator, humanity has lost the direction. And this loss of direction created a deregulation of the created order. As we can see, human beings no longer consider the universe as sacred. The God-created world has become just a collection of natural resources for economic exploitation. Freedom without limit and a desire to live in God's strength, without self-limitation and without responsibility toward God, has created a deregulated human community. And I also think human beings' intelligence and imagination become distorted and rerouted. It is this constant deregulation, the persistent rerouting of our imagination that characterizes our idolatrous civilizations. And we continue to descend deeply into this deregulation to the point that it has deeply affected not only human beings, but also our common home, the planet Earth. Unfortunately, humanity seems to be totally enchanted. It looks like humanity has entered into this crisis with no possibility of turning back. Are there any consequences for humanity? Yes, there are consequences. The Bible tells us that this is not the first time that humanity has tried to ignore God. We also know from the Bible that this has never happened without consequences. From the biblical narrative, we see reminders in the flood, Babel, Sodom and Gomorrah, and most importantly, the Babylonian exile. These are the consequences of human being ignoring God. Therefore, reading Jeremiah from my African perspective, I'll seek to understand what causes a community to drift away from God to become idolatrous. And two, we will not have time for that, I'm sure. From a case study in the book of Jeremiah, I will attempt to show what such a community looks like. Let's do a bit of Hebrew. We are not going to read it here. Thus says Yahweh. I'm taking Jeremiah chapter 2, verse 5. This is our main passage this morning. Thus says Yahweh, what wrong did your ancestors find in me that they went far from me? Most commentators read of Jeremiah describe the prophet as trying to help the people of Judah abandon their sin, repent, and avoid exile judgment. But after many years of carefully reading the book of Jeremiah, I've realized that by the time the prophet was commissioned, the people of Judah were very nearly too gone to turn back. Therefore, like our own society today, my understanding of the Judean community described in the book of Jeremiah is probably a nation in deep crisis with no possibility of turning back. We know the story. We are reading backward. Thus, the book of Jeremiah can be structured like this. We'll go very fast here. Chapter 1 is the commission. God sends the prophet. And he sends him with a mission to uproot and tear down, to destroy and overthrow. So these 4 verbs show that the fate of Judah seems to have been sealed. For the case of Judah as a nation, this uprooting and tearing down took place because the people had abandoned the relationship determined by the covenant with God. Then the second chapter after the commission, the second chapter, which I consider as a hypotext, I don't know how we pronounce it in English. We say hypotext in French. The second chapter, which I consider as a hypotext, that is a chapter on which all the subsequent chapters in the book of Jeremiah stand, explains why the people of Judah are going to be destroyed and taken into exile. As a hypotext, chapter 2 is key to the interpretation of the entire book of Jeremiah, and it contains the single most important reason for the judgment of the nation, that is idolatry. This issue of idolatry in chapter 2, as we said, is introduced by that passage, verse 5. What unrighteousness and justice have your fathers found in me, that they went far from me? The verb "they went far" is the translation of rachku, which means they have gone far. They went far. They walked away. They became distant. All commentators rightly understand the expression walking away from God as going after God's rivals or after idols in order to serve them. So the heart of Judah's problem is in this problem, walking away from God. And this walking away from God has significant spiritual and social implication. It is to walk away from the center of life, from true power, from true vision for the well-being of the community. It leads to a loss of direction and a distancing from the source of human worth. It culminates in the disintegration of human reasoning, of human community and the nation. For Israel and Judah, this distancing from God constitutes the theological explanation of the collapse of the nation. And the argument of this paper is that this is what has been going on in our global community. It might be important to repeat here that this drift away does not happen overnight. It is a slow and steady process which can easily be cataloged. As a community or a nation moves slowly away from God, it increasingly becomes dysfunctional and ends up in self-destruction if nothing is done. This is the problem reflected in the entire book of Jeremiah, and it can help us to understand, as I said, what is going on in our own global community. We are slowly moving further and further from God. Each generation is coming up with its own culture that distances the people from the Creator. This is Paul, I don't know how to pronounce that name, O'Callaghan. Somebody has problem with pronouncing my name, so I have problem to pronounce this one. I quote Paul, "We have arrived at a culture without faith, a culture willfully disconnected from the faith that gave life to it in the first place, and thus ultimately a fragile culture." And he continues, "This has led many people influenced by modern culture to a generalized loss of faith and to a pathology of individualism and ingratitude as they attempt to live in isolation from their fellows, unprepared to recognize the world they live in and the privileges they enjoy as God's gift." And I like that last word. We forget that what we are enjoying today is God's gift. Savage argued that the search for absolute freedom, this search for absolute freedom from God in Europe, he's talking about Europe, is characterized by a perpetual fight against the sacred in the public sphere and extreme aggressiveness in the approach toward religion. He or she, I don't know, I didn't check, laments that by adopting this ideology of absolute freedom, the European continent, that was for a long time the cradle of Christianity, has become its funeral home. I paused to ask a question. Will Europe come back to God? Maybe. But learning from Jeremiah's book, I reached the pessimistic conclusion that this looks unlikely before something like the flood, Babel, or the exile happens. I don't know exactly what this flood or exile will be, but something like God's judgment is coming, and we can see it coming, even if we constantly try to ignore it. What is the situation of faith in Africa? Africa shows a different trend. Christianity is growing very fast. And Lamine Sanneh, the late Lamine Sanneh, said what I quote there: we should take heart because suffering people have found faith and hope. The people have lined up, determined to enter the church, have eaten of the bread of adversity and tasted the waters of afflictions, and still they press to come into the church. The church exists to welcome precisely such as this, their personal or material circumstances notwithstanding. The quotation seems to indicate that in Africa, poverty and suffering open up an opportunity for the people to seek God and draw closer to Him. We can observe this everywhere on the continent. But the most important here is that whenever Africans flee for their life because of wars, conflict, famine, they move with their churches. Refugee camps are easily transformed to places of worship. And we have a case study of South Sudan. In 2013, a study was done that showed 2.5 million of South Sudanese were displaced. But at the same time, South Sudan was among the top 20 countries in the world where Christianity was growing the fastest. What is the relationship between suffering and the growth of the church? This is what Lamine Sanneh was trying to argue. We know this. Independent charismatic churches and prayer groups are mushrooming everywhere. You find them in the street, private houses, abandoned cinema halls, etc. And the poor flock to these places several times a week for prayer and worship. As the former Anglican bishop of Uganda says, on a Sunday morning, one has the sense of being in a religious supermarket of churches. And as with choosing a supermarket, the choice of church is yours. But while the situation in Africa is so different, some important questions remain. What kind of churches do we have in Africa? And which kind of Christianity is there? What happens, for example, after the refugees have prayed for peace? Does the war stop? Do those who pray change and behave differently? Has the high number of churches planted in our cities resulted in a matching improvement in the lives of the people who attend them? And why do people pray? Some churches are actually part of the problem in Africa. Instead of promoting peace, service, and community building, they have become places of division, breeding grounds for personal interest and tribalism, and even site for massacre. We know that. So it is also clear that something is wrong with African Christianity. The second part of our text, Jeremiah chapter 2, verse 5, says this. And they went, so after people, what wrong did your fathers found in me that they went far from me? And here the second part says, and they went after worthless things, and they became worthless. The second part of our main text states that by walking away from God, the people of Israel walked after, that is the word I was trying to, walked after Hevel, and they became Hevel. Those are the two last words in the Hebrew. I'm not going to read it. The people of Israel walked after Hevel and became Hevel. The word Hevel, translated by idols, literally means vapor. It means vanity, nothingness, nonsense, senselessness. Whatever the exact meaning of this verse, it is clear that it assumes a close association between vanity, nothingness, worthlessness, and idols. For God, idols are vanity because they have turned Judah away from its primary vision, from its initial relationship with God, and from its mission. As a result of following idols, Judah lost its value and identity and became useless for itself, for God, and for the rest of the world. The implications that people, community, and nations pursuing vanity or going after idols, or who have become vanity, get nowhere. In other words, vanity or idolatry in the book of Jeremiah is self-destructive. This worthlessness in the book of Jeremiah, sorry, did I make a mistake? Is not to be understood in abstract terms. There is a strong relationship in the book of Jeremiah between walking after God, following God, and the quality of life, and walking after idols and war, judgment, famines, and exile. This is what Jeremiah is trying to say. The moral degradation comes there. Consequently, idolatrous practices in Judah obscure the image of God in the people, destroy the relationship with God, and skew the just social shape. Idolatry has the ability to disorient the heart, that is, to confuse the seat of human comprehension and desire. Human beings can no longer discern reality. They can no longer understand that what they are worshiping is vanity, and that by worshiping vanity, they become themselves nothing before God. From our experience again in Africa, we know that when God is done away with, something or someone, a replacement will always emerge. Either a person, a personality cult, a system, a doctrine. We know this doctrine: socialism, Mobutism, Nkrumahism, or even an object to satisfy the corrupted human imagination. Does this say something about our own way of life? We followed yesterday our student about consumerism, and I even suspect our democracy as a kind of idolatry. The third part is a case study. We are not going to take it. After trying to answer the question, what takes people away? And then we take a case study, Jeremiah chapter 9, verse 1 to 6. In Jeremiah chapter 2, the people walked away from God. But when you read Jeremiah chapter 9, verses 1 to 6, God finally decides to walk away from the people. This is what chapter 9 tries to do, what I tried to do in chapter 9. What a community walking after idols looks like. A community walking after idols is a community abandoned by God. After they have abandoned God, God also decides to abandon them. So I'll skip all this. I will go to the conclusion. I complete this section before the last conclusion. This is what idolatry does. I think I've already said this. It takes captive the strength of the human imagination and slowly disorients the heart until it plunges the entire community, nation, into the abyss of chaos. I will encourage you to read Jeremiah chapter 9, verse 1 to 6, verses 1 to 6. This is the conclusion for that passage. Defining idolatry is a challenge because those who are accused of being idolaters may not be aware of it. Those who are aware that something is wrong in their relationship with God would not necessarily understand it in terms of idolatry. This is because idolatry is not essentially the fact of bowing before statues. Idolatry is a lifestyle. From the study of the book of Jeremiah, this paper defines it as walking away or distancing from God, who created everything that exists by his word and who remains in relationship with his creation. An individual, a community, or a nation that walks away from God cannot survive for a long time because it has lost the link with the source of true life. We live in a time when citizens, political and religious leaders, and social scientists, philosophers in many countries have the impression that their society are falling apart. This feeling of falling apart can be explained in many different ways, depending on one's basic values, interests, and specialities. Our argument is that, as in the book of Jeremiah, the entire human race is in crisis. This crisis comes from the abandonment of God, and it has affected every aspect of human existence. It looks unlikely that human beings will ever understand this situation and come back to God by themselves before something like flood, Babel, or the exile happens. It might be that our civilizations needs new Jeremiahs to remind humanity of this soon coming disaster. Thank you.
I would like to start, as we did yesterday, by giving our panelists, our speakers, a chance to first respond to each other. Any points of affirmation, contention, challenge that you would like to make before we go to questions from both the folks online and here in the room. So, Victor is smirking.
I love your last, your final line. Can you repeat it from your paper? What? Your final, your closing.
2 sentences.
Your closing sentences.
Is your microphone on over there, guys? Yep.
Yeah, there we go. Yeah, so your final sentences. Your God.
Yeah, your God could be my idol.
Yeah.
We're all going to meditate on that, like do Lexio and just kind of do that for the next 30 minutes.
Yeah, seriously. I mean, could you say a bit more about that?
Yeah, so if we accept that idols are a form of grasping at something that is not of God, and I was talking in the context of the narrative where God, the God of Moses,
equips the other and commands the person to go destroy completely the certain population. We sang at Easter, Pharaoh, the Egyptians, and his chariot were plunged into the sea. So what does that mean for the ones who have been destroyed through the name of this God? It would be like not a healing God, a creating God, or a saving God, but it's a destructive, it's a distortion of what is God. Yeah, so can we then come to a point where we all worship something, as Governor says, where the things we worship are not the very contradiction of the things that I dread most? Yeah, and I can say that as an African, that the idolatry critique from the West has left many of the people in Africa with cultural and spiritual chaos that is causing a lot of bleeding in the land. So it's in that context that I like to see what God you worship in how it embodies something that is life-giving and that creates communities of love and inclusion. And then we can actually say, this is who Victor worships. Why don't we take a look? I don't know if that makes sense.
No, it does. I mean, it's... So I'll pass it around. Yeah. So for me, it was a powerful way to conclude the paper, also because I appreciate the way in which you're also struggling with the grasping, with the this tendency of I think of many faith communities and many of us to grasp, to grasp at God, and reading Kavanaugh's book, that was this move of trying to have both a sympathetic reading of idolatry and a self-critical reading of idolatry. I think it's highly prophetic and necessary in the current context in the U.S., but also I think beyond as well. So yeah, thank you. Appreciate it.
And thank you very much. And I'd like to, you talked about Moise Naim, the Revenge of Power. His first work is about how power is fleeting. And the idolatry critique that you retrieved in a certain sense, how do you see in scripture, like the Magnificat, how he brings down the mighty and he lifts up the lowly? So how do you mediate this? How do you preach this gospel to our brothers and sisters at the southern border?
I don't. I mean, in a way. So I'll share this experience with you. So right after college, because life, I ended up at the Vatican at a meeting for migrants and refugees and people on the move. And I will never forget, I was in this small table with people from North America and Latin America, and one of the participants had been a migrant, a field worker, and he's looking at us, and he over time he became a pastoral agent, layman, father. He must have been in his early 70s, and he's looking at all the bishops in the room, and I think I was the only other lay person in there, and he looks at them and he says, when you in the church talk about migrants and refugees, you talk about us as if we're the problem. And then he says, we're not the problem. You're the problem. that paradigm shift as a borderlander, as somebody who's constantly navigating the accusation of being too American or not American enough, or too Mexican or not Mexican enough, or too Catholic and not Catholic enough, too much of this and not much, not enough of that. It really struck a chord, and I think Naeem's insights on power and polarization from a theological, ethical perspective, they intrigue me because they also break open this binary that I think the West's imagination is so enamored with. This either or rather than both and mentality. And the Catholic imagination that really grapples well with it, I think it's really struggling right now in the U.S. context. So I don't preach to my brothers in faith and sisters in faith in Mexico. I'm more worried about us. More worried about us, I think.
Two things that I learned from my brothers here. Worship is constitutive of community. Yesterday there was a question, and also we had it from our undergraduate students, people withdrawing and thinking I can worship alone. But I think what is at the heart of worship is community. And this is what I got from the presentation. Worship is constitutive of community. We worship to build a community, because at the beginning God created a community when he said it is not good for man to be alone. It is a community. We worship together. And also how we try, to push idolatry on other people. When Aaron was asked what happened, Moses asked the question, say, this calf came out of fire by itself. I liked that. That is it. We see it in other people. We are so paralyzed that we think the problem is the other guy, not me. And yet, we should be ourselves theologians, priests, pastors. Even as we meet here, what are we doing? What are we doing? Even scholarship can become idolatry.
Amen.
It can become idolatry. So it is all over here. He's saying, no, it can't be. But, well, yeah, so I think not only seeing it, talking about others, we need to talk about ourselves and reflect on what is going on and what is our contribution. Thank you.
Right, and that leads to, now, is this the microphone we want folks to come up to, or are we just going to raise hands? Okay, so there is a microphone up here, so if you want to ask a question, get in line. If someone would like to move, I don't touch tech, but someone who feels better. But my question to the panel, one of the things that I thought really connected your critiques that come from a careful, nuanced reading of Scripture is not the critique of the other idols that enthrall us, but our misconceptions of who God is, right? And our distortions of who we say God is, the God of the community, which so often is supported by scholarship, right? Bishops. The problem is not the migrants, right? It's their imaginations that are malformed theologically, right? What is the remedy for Christian misimaginations at the border in Africa, right? I mean, this obviously it's a bigger question than 25 minutes, but I would start with that question for y'all. Or you can ponder it while we wait the first gentleman at the. Sure.
I mean, briefly, I think a way forward again is compassion and this challenging, this ability to risk being compassionate. I appreciate the comment on imagination, not just bishops, theologians as well. We deeply need it. Our politicians, many of the politicians who are acting in this way at the border are self-identify as Catholic, and it is a challenge. It also reminds me of one of the reasons that I took one of my favorite courses in undergrad at Georgetown. It was a course called Catholic Imagination. And the professor teaching it looks at, asked us, why are you taking the class? And I answered, because I think it's an oxymoron. And he said, Victor, I'm going to have fun with you. And it was a great class. But to this day, the power of imagination is necessary. Was this something?
Yeah, so the question, I think, for me is about performance. I think it was it Patrick yesterday? You talked about the is that what do you call it? Dramaturgy or something like that? And then Bill talks about a liturgy. If something is not ritualized, in the African religious system, that has not become communal. And in the letter to Corinth, when I was trying to understand what is gift, a gift is not a gift until it's received. So it's performance. We need to see sites of performances, and we see these. That's why we love our saints, because they help, like Balthasar says, they are the best exegetes, the saints, because they interpret God for us, not often by words, but by performance. And we need those alternative sites, because that's exactly what Jesus did. But sadly, those alternate sites are usually the peripheries, and they point us to something bigger. That's what I would say.
All right.
Okay. Now I first start by thanking the three presenters. Let me start by thanking the three presenters, and I want to say you have been so wonderful, and your presentations have been so impressive too. And on a very special note, may I thank Professor Stan, and may I say here he was my teacher in the junior college, so I'm not strange to his explosive statements. But let me say right away that I do not agree with him that God is the first agency of idolatry. And I think that part of the problem is that I think that when God said, let us make image, God wants to make an image that will worship him. But I think when man makes an image, he's making an image he's going to worship. So I think we have to look at those misunderstanding. Otherwise, we fall into the problem of the fallacy of equivocation. So having said that, I want to ask my question straight away. If I understand the three speakers, they were talking about as I said, if I understand the three speakers, idolatry is enabled by fear, mistrust, and ignorance. But then my question is this. In a situation, especially in the primitive religions, where idolatry was carried out based on innocent ignorance, it was just man searching or yearning to find something to worship to satisfy the desires of the spirit. Will you blame the people of that generation or the people who worshipped idols then, or who created idols, for what they did? In that case, taking it back to part of the presentation in the Old Testament, who takes responsibility for what happened in the making of the golden calf? Aaron or the people? Related to that also is in our own time, where we have idolatry, especially in your presentation where you talked about the post-truth. In a situation where there is manipulation of information and people fall into social idolatry, not within their control, in the sense that there is no deliberate choice in what they are doing, but based on what you may call wide ignorance that has manipulated their insight, their conception, or clear understanding. And sometimes to their own convenient acceptance. We know the issue of some elections that were done here in America. We also know the issue of the Brexit. All these things were issues that were created not out of deliberate choices. So who takes less responsibility when somebody engages in this without deliberate choice, but then through the manipulation of another, or where such happens based on innocent ignorance? Thank you.
Oh my God.
We'll see if there's an answer for that one.
So I need more coffee. I'm gonna, by the way, I was going like this because I realized that I brought my wrong contact lenses. So it's been, so I'm going to answer the last question. I think post-truth, I mean, what I appreciate about the work of Moises Naim is that it frames polarization, it gives polarization from a from a perspective of political theory. I think it gives us a way to understand, or to at least have a picture of what may be happening, at least in the U.S. context. Naim argues that it's happening all over the world. But at least for me in the U.S. context, post-truth is a challenge, especially when it comes to communities of faith that are falling into this trap of populism and polarization, because it is having a limiting capacity to see the neighbor through the eyes of God, to understand and discern the neighbor as being made in the image and likeness of God. It is having that detrimental effect. I also think, as you saw in the paper, that this also has the consequence of limiting our ability to perceive reality, something that theologians and philosophers in Latin America have been grappling with, again, for decades. And then going back to this comment and question on imagination, I think it also stunts our Catholic imagination with some very practical implications. I'll give you just one. It always captures my attention how, when I go to parishes and centers of worship, it always captures my attention how sometimes, especially, this tends to be, at least in my experience, not as empirically backed observation, but in my experience, I'm always surprised or amazed by the inability of my European American brothers and sisters in faith to imagine the possibility that us or our children or our children's children could end up being refugees or asylum seekers. That possibility never crosses our mind. And yet it's fully present there in the experiences of many peoples, including most recently, Latinos and Latinas making it to the US and other parts of the world. But we never really seem to even consider that possibility, that we could end up being refugees and asylum seekers, or our children or our children's children. And that should give us pause. That should give us a sense of, whoa. That kind of imagination, I think, also cracks open the possibility of compassion, and it also opens up the possibility of being self-aware of the idolatrous ways in which we talk about ourselves as an all-powerful society. So much hubris.
Yeah, thank you, Victor. And I think the last point you made there is what I want to use to answer Humphrey. I think that one of the most neglected, especially in ecclesiology, quality of God is the humility of God. You know, when the humility of God, you know, Aquinas talks of God who bends down to us. The ancients use that term consistently. Synkatabasis, the divine accommodation. God has to, you know, to relate with us, you know, kenosis, all those things. We neglect this. Now, how I wish we can have a synod on humility or a synod on love, because so I have become, you know, I'm learning, I'm praying more, very, very intentional about how I talk about God. It's a mystery. So, and even how I make judgments about God and about other people. We need a lot of humility. And that's why my brother here, Cato, talks about, you know, the reading of Jeremiah. So to go back to idolatry, if you read Bill's book and many other people who, you know, embody that tradition, it's not easy to define idolatry. Just as not easy to talk about God or define God. St. Augustine said, if we understand God, then he's no longer God. Therefore, it's not about the judgment of the past. It is about what we can do today for human and cosmic flourishing, so that people can again believe in God. Like Pope Francis says, it's now by attraction, not by compulsion or by even different forms of evangelism that led to cultural genocide and reinforces the wars we have in the world today. It goes back to some of these claims. So I'm not judging the past or what you call the innocent ignorance. You know, to use Lonergan, I think there are differentiation of levels of consciousness, and so each age will have to respond in their own specific way, and then it will be wrong to use the, you know, synkatabasis. As we come to understand better, we become even humbler in the way we look at the past, but we become courageous in the way we walk towards the future. That's my concern, that like Cato said, some of the things we see in the continent of Africa, it breaks my heart. And that in Sudan that you have, I was in Adjumani, you know, close to your where your area. I was in Adjumani, met young girls who were born in refugee camps in South Sudan, and they are worshiping God every day. They said, without God, I wouldn't even have been born in this refugee camp. I am concerned what that means for that girl and what that means for a continent that worships God.
Just very quickly, in 2019, I was in Michigan. It was on Sunday, going to church. And then my friend told me, Cato, today you are going to share in our church, but please be careful. You know, we know that something is wrong with Trump and all this, but you know, many people in the church, they voted for Trump. Don't offend them, please. So I had no idea. I was not even going to talk about that. And then I felt like, what is it? You know that something is wrong and you don't want people to talk about it. Why are we so paralyzed? I think one of the consequences of idolatry is to paralyze us. We have been paralyzed. Let's say we are talking about the warming of our, global warming. Yes, Do we have solution? Yes. But try to tell people, stop your factories. Is it possible? No, we can't. We need money and money. That is it. We know something is wrong. It is there. But then let us die. Bad things are happening, but well, it is fine. That is idolatry. That is what idolatry does to us. Thank you.
So they invited you to come, but they wouldn't let you be Jeremiah. Little ironic.
Thank you for the presentation. I want to talk about Jeremiah. I liked very much your perspective. The idea that there's no time to avoid exile. That we to accept to read the history and say, even we pray for God, the true God, this is not possible anymore. This is something that other prophets that time would not accept. No, our God is real and powerful. So when I was in college, the professor on Old Testament said, prophets not are prophets, they are actually social scientists reading the history, what's happening, and what can do and what can change. And something that you said, you cannot change this process. So I was 6 years ago talking with John Cobb about the climate problems, etc. And now I think environmental problem, crisis, and inequality, the world, is something that I think we will not solve in the process of how is going capitalism, globalization, etc. So that's Jeremiah saying, yes, but you have to come back. You come back future. In the future, you have to buy. He bought a piece of land. So this is the kind of the realism and hope. Yeah, that is what is real faith for God. So in this case of the case, the girls in the camp, the question is not how can you pray for God. The question is which God you are praying or teaching people to. And the real God is not what you say, but the action. So that is, I like that. Idol doesn't make you get up and try to something. So I thought that I liked very much. I would like to say something more about that.
Yeah, maybe just quickly. When you read Jeremiah chapter 29, I know the plan I have for you, but that plan has to come after exile, after destruction, after the judgment. And then the new covenant in Jeremiah chapter 31 is the days are coming when I will rebuild you. It is coming. But for now, that is where we are. And that is my argument and the feeling like something has gone wrong. But what is it really? We can see it. Everybody's talking about it. Are we able to reverse it? I discussed with one of our undergraduate students yesterday. He was saying, I asked, how do you do that? How do you reverse it? I don't know. I said, yes. And in my heart, I said, where we are going, I think something will happen. But God has not abandoned his creation. Judgment is coming, but God has not abandoned us. There is a plan because humanity, the creation, belongs to God. So just to add that comment.
So it's a redefinition, too, of what constitutes power, what power looks like. Sir.
Thank you for the magnificent presentations. I would like to direct this question to my brother Cato. it is the apparent paradox that you seem to reveal between, a worshiping people in Africa, the widespread of Christianity, and at the same time, a kind of suggestion that what they may be worshiping may be some kind of idol. I'm not quite sure if that is what you were getting at. On the one hand, they're worshiping people, and on the other, they may be worshiping idol, which seems to imply that perhaps the dynamics of suffering they're going through may be explained by that. I'm not sure if that is what you were saying. I would like you to say more about that. And which was also, I think, just raised by Stan a moment ago about this girl that he met, worshiping God all the time, and that it concerns him about perhaps the kind of God that girl is worshiping. So I was wondering if you may say more about that also. Thank you.
Yeah, I thank you all especially for the invitation to come. I see some good books, I listen. I think something is wrong with our Christianity in Africa. I call it a Christianity without impact. We pray a lot, but we are ready to kill one another. That is especially where I'm coming from. And in 2002, 2001, there was war, and 95% of our city, of our town, Bunia, was evacuated. And there was a rebel group outside the city. So they had their guns stored somewhere in the church. The bishop helped them to hide the guns because they are the militia from his ethnic group. But how to transfer that gun outside the city to reach the rebel groups? So they designed a device. They took a coffin and Christian women wearing uniform with women of the good news singing, and they were in that coffin full of ammunition. So they kept singing, and the UN soldiers were there. They didn't understand what is going on. So can we see? Say, no, he died before yesterday, and just it is smelling bad, please. And then at one point, the UN soldiers said, we have to stop them and see what is going on. We are suspecting that something is wrong. And then when they opened, they saw what they saw. So what is Christianity in Africa? That is the whole question. I don't have an answer now, but I'm interested in it. What is it that people like? We go to church, we open new churches, but we need to understand that form of Christianity. That is why when they say Christianity has died up in Europe and so on, I'm not very excited to say, yes, we are doing fine. I'm not sure. I'm not sure that we are doing fine until we find the best way of being Christians. So I don't have an answer, but I think that is the direction we need to go. Thank you.
Yeah, and I will add just an essay I just finished, and the work I'm doing is Where is God in Africa? That I think that is not every growing church that is healthy, and is not every healthy church that is growing. And we must deepen what can make our churches healthy, so to make our society healthy. And I think it's a task that is left for all of us. And it's not an easy task, but I'm happy that, two of us are allies in saying that the center of Christianity is not in Africa. It is it is here we are the center for world Catholicism.
There's a plug. Yeah. We're past time, so we don't have any more time for questions or comments. I'm so sorry. We're at 12:02. And with that, I would like to thank our presenters for a provocative panel that has opened up more questions than they've answered, but that's good.